Okay, Barbara, we're live.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm holding up a copy of Finale by Iah Hamilton, the fourth book that is told in it really is the Ava Lee universe, but from Uncle Chow Tung's perspective. And I agree with the author that the back of Uncle's head makes him look like President Obama. It really does, Ian.
Mm-hmm. I made that comment and they didn't change it.
Well, you know, when I log into my Chase credit card account, the picture of the young woman gazing out to sea, that's their lead thing, looks exactly like my daughter from the back. So I decided that, you know, I didn't think they're actually shopping social media. I think there's just resemblance among people, maybe
Right.
even more so from the rear.
Right, probably so. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, this is in fact Uncle Chow Tung, but you know, Ian, I thought of him as, I don't know, sturdier. I mean, this guy looks fairly slender. What's your vision of Uncle physically?
He was always small. He was always small, and he was always not much larger than Ava, and right from the outset. So I saw him as sort of being 5'4", 5'5", maybe 135, 140 pounds.
Okay. I don't know why, but maybe it's just the thought of him being, you know, as head of a triad. I thought of him as being more of a, you know, gangster build, but he's not really one, is he?
No, he's not. And he was the head because he was smart. So it was all about intelligence and not brawn. You know?
So you've had to learn all the ranks of triad and command and who they are. And it was interesting. S.J. Roseanne wrote a really good book set in New York's Chinatown. I think it was last year. And she used some of the same, you know, same terminology, red pole, white fan, and so forth. Is that all, you know, something that is easily available for people to learn? How did you get familiar with it?
I mean, I researched it, and it is readily available. Some of the stuff was harder to find. In fact, a lot harder to find. I was in one of the books, one of the Uncle books. He's involved in an initiation rite for some young triads who are moving up from being Blue Lanterns to become full 49ers. And finding that initiation rite took me for ages. But I eventually found it in an old edition of one of the Hong Kong newspapers.
Hmm.
And I think the article was at least 30 or 40 years old.
Do you think that still applies in today's Hong Kong with all the crackdown that's gone on, or is the crackdown more political than it is criminal?
Well, it's political, and you have to remember the triads are in partnership with the Chinese government.
Right.
So the communists have no interest in eliminating triads. Their only interest is engaging them as partners. I mean, when you had the protests a few years ago, and gangs were cracking down on the protesters, the gangs were triads.
So basically, they're kind of enforcers for the party when they need to be.
They are, and in the third Uncle book, I actually write about how the Chinese government and the triads became partners.
Okay.
And there was a quotation going back to the 70s from the guy who was the head of state security for the Chinese government, talking about triads and talking about how they could be good citizens and they could be good partners, and that the Chinese government had an interest in engaging with them, and they obviously did. So when the Chinese government decides they want to take some American or Canadian citizen out of a hotel room and ship them across the border to charge them with something, they use the triads by and large to do the shipping across the border. So there's a definite relationship between the Chinese government and the triads.
Well, but since part of Uncle's storied career here is, which you remind us of in this book, but we learned it several times, him escaping from communist China by swimming across the bay in its terrible waters, you know, to freedom, so to speak. What's Uncle's position in regard to the government, or do you just not go into it?
No, I do, because he, again, in the third book, he has to make a decision about whether or not to do a deal with the Chinese government. And he hates them.
Right.
He hates them. But at the same time, he realizes that when Mao took power initially in 56, 57 or 59, one of the first things Mao did was eradicate the triads in China. I mean, he just basically wiped them out, which is what sent them to San Francisco, North America, sent them everywhere else. But once they were deciding to go back into Hong Kong, they weren't allowed to put troops on the ground there. Okay, but they needed sort of a militia, and the triads became their option. And so for Uncle, it was a matter of, if I can protect the triads by cutting this deal, it's something I have to do. Okay, because the option is to try to take on the Chinese government, and no one takes on the Chinese government and wins. So he was just being totally pragmatic.
So as Uncle rises up through the ranks, what are the different positions? What do they do? I mean, if you're a blue lantern as opposed to a white fan, as opposed to a red pole, what is your job?
Okay, so if you're a blue lantern, you're a trainee. Okay, you're an intern, basically. If you're a 49er, you're a regular soldier on the ground. Okay, you have you're making me put my mind back in this. The red pole runs the gang. He's the enforcer. So anything to do with violence or anything else, everything goes through the red pole. The white fan is the one who looks after the bookkeeping and the money in the county. Okay, and that's sort of the structure.
So Uncle's real strength was, in part, that he was very good at the white fan sort of thing.
He was very good with money, and was careful to protect their future going forward. Okay, so I think the second book, he decides they can't keep doing what they've been doing. Okay, so they can't keep shaking people down. They can't keep doing drugs. They can't keep doing this kind of thing, because all they're doing is bringing the police down on them harder and harder and harder. So he decides they have to find a way to branch out in a way that won't attract the interest of the police. And that's when he goes to Shenzhen, and he sees what's happening in Shenzhen, and decides that making counterfeit clothing, which is, as far as he's concerned, a victimless crime, okay, and making knockoff phones and doing all of that stuff is the way to go. So he takes the gang away from sort of the violent crime that they're doing, and the crime that picks on the population in general, and moves them into something which actually, you could say, aids the population in general, because he's providing them with goods they otherwise couldn't afford. So that was a transition that he made.
So did he actually hold all those positions as he rose up to be the head of which triad is it? What do you call your triad?
He was with the Fan Ling gang.
Okay.
So Hong Kong had 18 or 20 different gangs, all neighborhood sort of gangs. And he was in Fan Ling, which is in the new town in the New Territories. And that was his base. But there were gangs gangs all over the place, Kowloon, Hong Kong Island, everywhere.
So he was really good at negotiating with them. I mean, he was head of this one triad, but he worked very hard at good relationships when he could. Well, the other triads.
He thought that was crucial to their survival as a group. Okay, that you couldn't keep going after, you couldn't keep doing things which caused the Hong Kong police force to come down on you. And the Hong Kong police force had one division totally committed to eradicating triads. Okay. And his view was anything we do which draws attention to ourselves is a bad thing. Okay. So he was always about staying out of the limelight, no, as little violence as possible, leave the public alone. Okay. And so the only violence in the books that he ever condoned was triad against triad. He never involved citizens in it.
So basically for him, a triad was like a career path. You know, you could join the Bank of Hong Kong, or you could, in fact,
become a triad.
yeah.
And historically, Barbara, the triad started off in the 15 or 1600s as a political organization. They initially were formed to combat a corrupt emperor. Okay, and when they succeeded in bringing the emperor down, all of a sudden they were at loose ends, and they fractured and they went in different directions. So you had triads who formed labor unions, you had triads who formed guilds, you had triads who went into crime, obviously, but it wasn't uniform. So they were doing all of these different things, but they're all still under the same umbrella. They still had the 36 oaths that they took. I mean, they still tried to perform under the same principles. They just went in different directions.
Right, but basically, aren't they? I mean, the end result was financial. I mean, that they were, as I say, a career path, and so they chose different ways to go about making money to support everybody after their political.
Think of them as a fraternal order.
Okay.
Okay, and all try to look after each other at the end of the day, and look after their families. Okay, because the obligation went beyond the immediate member. It also extended to his family. So if you were a triad and you ended up in jail or you ended up getting killed, your gang looked after your family. So that was your security moving forward.
So when Uncle decides to, or anyway, when he comes to mentor Ava Lee, and their object initially is basically bad debt collection or going after money. That was all part of his idea of, from his white fan experience. It wasn't a private enterprise for Uncle, right? It was was it for the benefit of the triad, or was it for Ava Lee herself? Who was the beneficiary?
So he retires from the triads.
Okay.
And he leaves Fan Ling because as long as he's there, the gang will sort of revolve around him, and he wants to give the new leader a clear path. So Uncle leaves Fan Ling and he moves to Kowloon, and he's there, and people know he's there. And all of a sudden, he's got friends who are running into problems, or associates who are running into problems with bad debts. And they don't know where to turn. And some of them end up coming to Uncle to say, help, okay? And he engages a couple of guys, and they start to get into the debt collection business. But he's doing it to help friends. He's not doing it to make money per se.
Right.
But he has to charge the same fee as all the other debt collectors, or the people who are coming to him won't think he's any damn good. Right? So it's a sort of thing. So he's doing this, but then people start coming to him with issues which are way more complicated, and he doesn't have the people who can manage it. And this is when he meets Ava. So he's got this young forensic accountant all of a sudden, where he can take on debts that are way more complicated and larger than anything he'd been doing. And that's how the relationship started. And so he sort of fell into the debt collection business. Then once he got into it, it got bigger and more complicated. Then he meets Ava. And once he meets Ava, he doesn't want to get out of the debt collection business because it'll mean the end of his relationship with her. So he's sort of locked into it because of her.
Right. No, I understand that. And I've always loved that aspect of it. And the fact that it's some point before, I'm trying to remember if it happened before you wrote the first of these 4 books about Uncle. Ava, he encourages Ava to move on. Maybe it's in this book. In fact, we see that from, I've read them all, so I mix them up from his perspective, but he can see that she needs to move on from this debt collecting
Yeah.
mentor thing that she's got and use her money to invest with the 2 women that she
Yes.
decides to partner with, the 3 sisters, as you call them.
Yeah.
So she's basically been trained, but now he thinks she needs to go out on her own.
Yes. But he knows he's ill.
Right.
Right. And he knows he's not going to be around much longer. And he wants her to have a past with friends. Okay. And so Mei Ling Wang, who appears in book 3, the Ava Lee series, and they start off, Ava and Mei Ling start off with a really rocky relationship.
Yes, I remember it. There was a very bad.
A horrible relationship, horrible start to a relationship. But Uncle thinks Mei Ling is perfect partner for Ava. So he keeps sort of trying to convince her to talk to Mei Ling. And eventually they come together and they work their issues through and they become partners. But Ava still will not leave Uncle. So even though Mei Ling is trying to become a partner and Ava wants to become a partner, she will never do it until Uncle is gone or Uncle is finished. So that was the end of book 6, of course, the 2 sisters of Borneo when Uncle passes. And then Ava and Mei Ling become partners with Amanda Yee, the other of the 3 sisters, who's Ava's sister-in-law. And I love the relationship between the 3 women because it's the level of trust and faith they have in each other is something I love writing about because they never doubt each other. They never ever doubt each other, and I think that's fantastic in terms of any.
Well, there's some very high risk stuff that goes on that really tests character.
Yeah.
But since you're the god of this universe that you have created here with Ava Lee and Uncle, did you? I mean, it was in your power to give Uncle cancer, in this book he finally succumbs. Did you do that because you felt like the series Ava Lee needed to move on from this partnership with Uncle and asset collecting or recollecting rather into new fields?
It was a subconscious decision. So when I started to write the first Ava book, storylines would come to me, and an arc developed, and I had very little control over it, truthfully. Okay, so writing the first book, plot comes to me for a second book. I plugged the plot line into the first book. I'm writing the second book, and I know book 3 and book 4. But when I was writing book 3, I realized Uncle was going to die at the end of book 6. Okay. And if you go back, I'm not suggesting you do, but reading book 3, the first indications of his illness are in that book. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then book 4, a little more indication. Book 5, even more pronounced. And book 6, it's obvious. But it was a slow build up. But it started in book 3 because I knew that's where I was going. And I don't know why I was going there. I wasn't trying to separate them. It's just that was the arc I had, the story arc I had in my head. And I just went with it. So, but then after book 6, and he's gone, and she's with new partners, and I bring in Zhu from Shanghai, who Uncle had been mentoring, and he's an important connection back to Uncle. Okay, so the Uncle connection never disappears; it's still there. Okay, so you've got the Zhu Ava connection, which constantly brings Uncle into the conversation. You have Uncle replacing her father in her dreams. So Uncle visits her constantly to talk to her. So I've kept Uncle alive, I think, in the books. He's just not an active everyday presence.
Well, I think you do. And of course, when we learn Uncle's history and discover that his fiance died on this swim, when the uncle and she and I don't remember 2 or 3 others, was it, decide to swim across the bay to get out of communist China and she dies because he can't, and you describe it better in this book than I think or more detail anyway, in this book, in that he had some sort of, I don't remember whether he ingested water. Anyway, he can't make the swim entirely on his own, and he climbs up on the door of the raft, whatever it is they're clinging to. And while he is there, she slips away, and he blames himself always that if that hadn't happened, that she wouldn't have died. So he never marries. He has no children. He basically tries to keep the memory of his fiance alive. And so Ava's really his only chance at a daughter.
Yes, a granddaughter or a daughter. And not only does he keep his fiance's memory alive, he never tells a single person about her.
Right. Except at the end, when he delegates somebody else to go to the place where her urn is, that he's assembled, because he doesn't actually have any part of her, but he assembles some sand and some other things and creates a memorial thing. And then he keeps track of that all his life. And then when he dies, he wants it to be included in his coffin. And you have a truly memorable funeral scene. But if I remember right, it's in an Ava book, and it's not in an Uncle book because he's dead. So he can't tell us that story.
Yes. And so it's in the Sisters of Borneo, that funeral scene. And so when I was writing the 3rd book, and I knew he was going to die at the end of the 6th book, I wrote the last 2 chapters in my head while I was writing the 3rd book. So I knew exactly how the 6th book was going to end. So I had the whole thing structured in my head. And when I finished writing it, it was one of the first times I felt like I was really a writer, that I was very proud of the last 2 or 3 chapters of that book. And truthfully, I can't read it now without tearing up.
I can't read it without tearing up. I think you did an amazing job doing it. And Sarah, you decided to write these 4 books from Uncle's perspective, because up until you did that, we have only seen him through Ava Lee's perspective.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So
you're revisiting, in fact, part of Ava Lee's life and her time with Uncle, but you're showing it to us in a different way. Yeah. That's a really interesting thing to do.
And it was hard.
Yeah.
It was like this book was really difficult to write. So I started off trying to write it in 3 parts. And the first part was taking the Dragon Head of Hong Kong, which is the prequel, and shows how Ava and Uncle met for the first time. So I was going to tell that through his eyes. And then the Scottish banker Surabaya through his eyes, and the 2 Sisters of Borneo. And it didn't work really well. It was long, it was slow. And the problem was the Dragon Head of Hong Kong part. So in discussion with my editor, Doug Richmond, who was terrific, I decided to turn that part of it into the prologue and epilogue. And so I cut 100 pages out of the first draft. And this is what you ended up with. So, but I think it kind of worked. I think it works actually very well. But it was interesting telling it through his eyes, because I didn't have to stick. I didn't stick to the same strict storyline or dialogue, because why would you, right? Everyone sees everything differently. So That was interesting, I have to say.
I think it works really well. I mean, I've read my way through the entire Ava Lee series, as you know, and then the Uncle Chow Tung series actually are alliterative because they're called Fate, Foresight, Fortune, and now Finale.
Finale, yes, yeah, yeah. So I wrote the books at the suggestion of my publisher and editor. After, I don't know, the 8th, 9th, or 10th, whatever Ava Lee book, there's 15 now. So they came to me and said, because everyone was upset Uncle died. Okay. And including my wife. Everyone said, why did you have to do that? Why did you have to do that? Anyway, so they came to me and said, you know what? Why don't you write a series about Uncle? And the moment they said, I never thought of it. The moment they said it, though, it seemed perfect to me. And I rattled off 3 storylines in about a day and shipped them off. And we did a contract like the next week. So that was all good. So I've got, so this Uncle's coming out. Now we're talking about, and I'd actually like feedback on this, between The Dragon Ahead of Hong Kong, which is the Ava Lee prequel,
Right.
and The Water Rat of One Chai, which is the first full Ava Lee novel, there's a 10-year gap. Okay.
You could
And
fill
my
it in.
agent believes that it would be a great idea to fill that 10 years with Ava and Uncle stories, going back in time, sort of a retro Ava Uncle.
Are you thinking of full novels rather than?
Yes,
Yeah.
full novels.
You know what? I think one of the interesting things about the whole series has been the fluidity of time in it, Ian. And all stories are not linear. So why not go back and do that? I think I mean, while you've been writing Uncle, you've also done at least one. I've lost sort of count of when they all come out. The Ava Lee, so we've read an Uncle, but then there's a new Ava Lee, right? And there've been either one or two.
There's a new Ava Lee coming out at Christmas.
Oh, goody.
Called The General of Tiananmen Square. And I think it's one of the best I've ever written. And following up on that, I'm actually writing the last chapter of the Ava Lee after that one. And that's called The Fury of Beijing. And the fury refers to the furies of mythology, vengeance-seeking women. And Ava is the vengeance seeker. And it's so that would be in I lose track, that would be 2023, whatever.
In order to keep, and I've had this discussion with a lot of people. I had it with Mark Rainey last night about the Gray Man, his iconic character. You can't age her too fast or too whatever, because she can't do what she does if she gets too old for it.
Yeah.
So in order to keep those books moving along and maintain various storylines, I think going back and filling in at the beginning is a really nice idea. You can't, he's dead now. So
yes,
you can't go on. You've done a really excellent job with this quartet, which is an interesting structure in itself, because most of the time people write trios, and this is a quartet. So I like that already. But I can't, I mean, it's different, but I don't see why you can't go back, and then we can spend more time with Ava and Uncle.
Yes.
And we don't, it's like Morse. Think about it. Morse was on TV for a long time. And then he had to die because John Thaw had a heart attack and died on television. And that was like, sort of the end. And then they did Sergeant Lewis, his sidekick, moving forward. But then they decided to do Endeavor, which is just wrapping up, and is the young Morse. So we've been able to see Morse's story from 3 different perspectives in 3 different points in time. And I think there's no reason why, you can't do the same thing. And I think your fans, such as myself, would like to spend more time with Ava Lee and Uncle. And the only way you can do that now really is to go backwards, because you can't go forward.
What's interesting with going back, from my viewpoint, is you can watch her develop and grow. Okay. Watch her become a lot more sophisticated, more worldly. And I can also deal with issues of criminality, scams, et cetera, that took part during that time period, right? And that interests me as well. So,
Sure. Well, in a way, it's historical fiction in the
yeah,
sense that it's not. But, let's talk about why I love this series because, we're just talking about relationships and stuff here. I don't know why my hair looks like it's standing up on end, but it
your
does.
hair looks better than mine does, Barbara.
Well, there we go. But, one of the reasons I love the books, well, there are two main reasons, aside from I like Ava Lee and Uncle a lot and some of the other characters, is one, I love the landscapes. I am never going to go to Sarawak. I'm just not going to go there. And I do think that you have taken us not just to interesting places in Asia that we wouldn't normally visit, but we've been to Milan for the fashion industry. We've been to the Faroe Islands where when I first went to the Faroe Islands, puffin was on the menu. And now it's become like a locavore haven and capital, but you take us to the Faroe Islands and food. I mean, you've given us a wonderful tour of places that many of us are never going to visit. I thought, I'm terrible on titles, but I thought your book is it Tawi Tawi? Where are you in the Philippines? Is that the Tawi Tawi?
Tawi Tawi, yeah.
Okay, I mean, I'm not going to go there either. And yet I was completely fascinated with it. So part of it is I really love the landscapes and the cultures that you depict. But the other part is I've always liked, not all crime has to be about murder. Crime fiction, most people, it just has to be a mystery. I've always loved heist novels. I've always loved cons and so forth. Your background in business, which was considerable before you started to write, has allowed you, along with your own interest and research skills, to take us into all kinds of global enterprise. You've shown us the connectedness of it. I thought of you, Ian, when I ordered something. I think it was a pair of shoes on Instagram because they looked interesting. Fatal mistake. I'm never buying another thing on an Instagram clothing site. But anyway, and they didn't come, and I was really getting annoyed. And then I got this email from some unknown sender, and it said, your merchandise has arrived in the port of Shanghai. And I thought, well, great, eventually it will get to me. But I thought of you because, I thought, okay, I've ordered a pair of shoes off this, thing. And clearly they've been manufactured like someplace over in Asia and made their way to Shanghai. And presumably they're going to make their way to, I don't know, at Long Beach, San Francisco, whatever, and eventually to Scottsdale. Yeah. But I love the way the email read, your merchandise has arrived in the port of Shanghai. And I thought, okay. And then I thought of Ava because, that's the kind of stuff that you have made us all really enjoy learning. And the money, of course, is, that's where the money is in these different enterprises that you are exploring.
Yeah. Well, in terms of going the retro Ava books, I pitched a couple of plot lines. One is about this family from Singapore trying to build a warehouse complex in Guangzhou.
Right.
And the grandson of this, the patriarch of this very wealthy family has been sent to do it. And he gets all the way to the point of getting a signature on a piece of paper when he finds out that he's lost the deal. It's all about how the deal has gone south and how the mayor, the son of the mayor, some German businessman, just how what a quagmire it is trying to do business in China. And how at the end of the day, a contract is meaningless. It's all about who you know and what they control. And so that was one of them. And another one is about trying to chase down a scammer in Venezuela. And all about what was going on in Venezuela at that time in history, which I knew intimately, actually. And it was one of the scariest, messiest places in the world to be. And I'm dying to write about it. So, yeah.
Well, your plots are immensely complicated. And Ava Lee, has a wonderfully organized mind in her negotiating skills that she's learned from Uncle, or her intimidation skills, let's be real. also greatly contribute to it. So they're very complex stories, and people do die. But it's not about who murdered Aunt Jane in the library.
No, it's not.
It's completely different. But all the relationships keep growing. Ava's complicated family. She lives in Canada because her mother is her father's second wife and was kind of a lot of trouble. So he basically sent her off to Canada with Ava Lee and her sister. Ava Lee herself is a lesbian, so she had one relationship that really never showed in the early books, but then you're interested in Chinese films. So you decided to give Ava Lee a Chinese film actress. Yes. So that you could in fact explore the movie making industry in China, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and the General Tiananmen Square, which is the book which is out at Christmas, is about them releasing the film they've made.
Okay, that Fang has made.
And the film is called Tiananmen. And anything with the name Tiananmen, the Chinese government's going to hate. And so it's about the Chinese government trying to crush the film and crush anyone connected to the film. And it has a great climax, which leads into the book I'm writing now, The Fury, and which will be probably the most violent book I've ever written, because I don't like the violence to be sort of deliberate. I mean, a curse which is basically trying to defend herself. I mean, that's usually when any violence takes place. She doesn't initiate a lot of it, but in this case she does. So it's in my head because I'm writing the last chapter.
Well, but the arc of that's, I mean, there's been several books leading up to this film. I mean, in one, they've had to rescue this director who, was in really terrible shape. For another, Ava Lee develops a relationship with the actress. So each of the books is complete, but there is sequential storyline that, makes it interesting to read them that way.
Barbara, it's so odd how it happens because I don't do plot. I don't plan my books, so I don't sit down and do plot outlines. But I forget who wrote it. But I read a quote from a female writer who said, when you're writing a book, you come across a character who bores you, get them out of the book. And if you find a character who actually interests you, don't be afraid to run with them. So when I was writing the book, The Goddess of Yantai, where Ava has to meet with Pang Fei's ex-husband, the director, and he's this wasted human being. My initial idea when I was writing the book was she would just sit down with him and he would help her with the immediate problem. Okay. But as she's talking to him, it occurs to me, because when I'm writing about Ava, I think I am Ava. I know that sounds really bizarre, but that's sort of how it works. She's talking to him, and all of a sudden, I think to myself, oh my God, she's going to try to rehabilitate him. Okay. And that's what spurred the plot line for the next book, and the book after that, and now another book. So that one conversation has created three books at least. So.
Isn't it wonderful that you know your characters so well that you can do that? I'm fascinated with them because they just, they keep moving forward in interesting ways. I don't always expect it to go the way that it does, which makes it a lot of fun to read them.
Well, that's something, and I enjoy writing that way. I mean, one of the things that used to discourage me when I was reading a lot, not writing, when I was reading, was to have an author I absolutely loved just sort of start to nail it in, like the same basic story over and over again. And I never want to do that. I mean, I want to keep her moving forward. I want to change the people around her and just keep it going, And so even though I'm going to go back, I think, and do some retro Ava Uncle books, I think there will be more new Ava books coming forward. I think the one coming out at Christmas is the 15th, Ava.
Is it? I thought, unless are you counting the Dragon Head of Hong Kong?
Of course I am, because I wrote it.
Exactly. I think you've gotten 15. I think the Sultan of Sarawak is the last one they're listing here.
Okay.
As book 15. And then we've got the Lost Decades of Uncle Chow, which we're just, talking about here. But once again, I will say that when you're writing the older books, Ava Lee can move forward just weeks at a time, contemporarily. And that way you don't have to deal with problems of her aging physically or mentally, because Ava Lee does end up, she has martial arts skills, and she does, in fact, from time to time, really have to deploy them.
Yes. And she gets whacked once in a while. She's not without scars. And the other, one of the others, I know this will sound like I'm an old fart, but one of the reasons I like the idea of going back is I don't have to worry about new technology.
Yes.
Like I don't have to worry about her texting, okay, or whatever, Zooming or WhatsApp or whatever. Okay. I can keep it locked in. So it's more about, she can't Google her way to a solution, she has to sort of sort it out.
Well, that's one aspect, but let's remember too that tracking technology is so good now that some of the things that she does would be harder to conceal today, because people can be tracked more easily than it was before.
Absolutely. I was reading an article in the New Yorker about a month or two ago about a program, I think it's called Pegasus, that the Israelis developed, that basically can lock onto any phone in the world and know everything you're doing and everything you're saying. There aren't many places you can hide these days, So
now what you learn is that any experienced operator would leave their phone at home or someplace other than keeping it on them, and use burner phones, because otherwise, you're just going to be burned. But that gets too complicated too, if you've got like 5 phones on you.
And I hate writing about that stuff. I like the human element more than the technical element.
Right. Well, and you send her to places where you wouldn't think that would be a huge problem, like, Sarawak or the backwoods in the Philippines or something. But really, modern technology is such that it's not dependent on landlines or anything. So there's almost nowhere. I still remember, Ian, that the terrible story of the party, I think he was New Zealand or Australian, I can't remember which. Anyway, he was guiding on Mount Everest, and something or other went wrong, and they end up all of Mount Everest dying. They're not going to get down out the mountain. And the last thing he does,
oh, I'm losing you, Barbara.
His satellite phone, and he to tell his wife and family.
I just lost you there momentarily, Barbara. Oh, you're frozen.
You did for a second. I know it. It's the heat. Anyway, my point is that if you can call home from the top of Mount Everest, there's really no way that that this isn't going to be an issue in anything you do. So, yep. Anyway, I love this series, and for those of you who haven't read it, it's really a joy to do it. I do have I probably ought to ask your publisher this, but for a long time it was really difficult to get the first 4 books in the Ava Lee series, not the Dragon, but let me go back here. The Water Rat of Wanchai, The Disciple of Las Vegas, The Wild Beasts of Wuhan, and The Red Pole of Macau. Yeah. And I can't recall. Have those rights reverted to you, and House of Anansi is now publishing them all across the board?
I believe that's true. Karen could answer that better than I. Because they were initially published by Picador. Right. In the US. And I know Nancy was trying to get them reverted, and I think they've at least got a couple of them reverted. I don't know.
Well, it was from a bookseller standpoint more difficult to get people into the series when they couldn't read the early books. Yes, and so one way around that, of course, is if you write some of these early stories, then we can kind of bridge the gap. But a lot of readers want to read a series from the beginning.
Yes, which I love, since there are 15 books in the series.
That's right. Yay. Let's call up Patrick and see if he has any questions or comments, or in case I freeze again.
Okay.
Hi there. Let's see. Just check and see. Okay, well, Karen has weighed in. She says we have 2 of the 4 reverted so far, so that's good. 2 of the 4 books.
I'm really glad to hear that, Karen. And since you're listening to this, I hope you will be assiduous in trying to get the rest of them back, because I think we could find a new audience if we're able to sell the books, as I say from the beginning. Mystery people who like this kind of story of fiction often want to read it from the first. You know, they're
Yeah.
completists. So that's really good news. I'm glad you were able to do that. Super.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah, a couple of people want to know about, have there been any TV nibbles for these books?
Oh, yes, they're nibbles.
No bites though.
Well, there was a company here who held the option for 9 years. And they kept renewing, and that was their choice, not ours. And we finally were in a position where we could let their option lapse. I changed agents as well, so I'm now with ICM in New York and LA. And so they're actively involved in finding partners. I know we've turned down 3 offers, and they're trying to get. They have someone specifically in mind that they want to work with, but it's a slow process, and we'll see where it ends up. I try not to think about it because all I get is frustrated. But hopefully we eventually will get there. At least
I hope so too. Going to be an interesting casting. You know, I don't have anybody in mind, but Ava Lee is such a complicated character. I think casting would be really a fascinating thing.
I agree. But you know, they're talking about finding the right showrunner. So they want a showrunner who's Chinese American or Chinese Canadian. So they're trying. That's one of the reasons it's moving slowly, because they're trying to equip it that way. I don't think they'll have a problem finding an actress, truthfully. There are a lot
of actresses.
A lot of very young,
talented
actors.
Yeah.
What I don't want them to do, of course, is cast someone who's not Chinese American or Chinese Canadian or Chinese. You can't take someone who's of Japanese origin or Korean origin and plug them into it, because it would be like taking someone who's German and plugging them into a film that's Italian. No, it doesn't work that way.
Did you watch the Donna Leon series about Commissario Brunetti?
I love that. My wife loves that series so much. In fact, she just bought the last book. I love that series.
Well, I'm a big fan of the series, but the TV is German. It's made in Germany and it's cast with Germans, and they don't look Italian. They don't behave like Italians. And
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
No. I've watched all the TV, and in fact, they changed the lead character. They changed Brunetti. They cast a new person. But anyway, the entire thing is German. And I agree with you that, you know, if you're going to do Ava Lee, it should be Chinese.
Yes.
And I didn't mention one of the things I particularly like about the series is that while Ava Lee is indeed a globetrotter, and many of these the stories take place in exotic locations, in all of the books, there's time in Canada and there's time in Toronto's Canadian community. Yeah. And I think that's a wonderful thing too, that we get to explore that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's one reason the books, Canadians love reading about Canadian scenes, Canadian places. So,
right.
It couldn't have been any other way for me, you know. So,
are there
Patrick, anything else?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, who are some of your contemporaries or your peers that you enjoy reading?
Oh goodness me, I'm looking at that. I'm a huge Richard Stark fan. Okay, I've got, I think, all of his books. But the truth is, I stopped reading fiction when I started writing it.
Ah,
So I'm sort of frozen in time. So when I started to write, I had this voice in my head, in my own rhythm, and I was deathly afraid of introducing someone else's tone and rhythm. So I stopped reading fiction. I read nonfiction, but I stopped reading fiction. But I was a huge, I read about every mystery crime writer that there was. Richard Stark was a huge, huge favorite. And another writer that I couldn't wait to get my hands on his books, Patrick O'Brien, who wrote the Jack Aubrey naval series set during the Napoleonic Wars. I absolutely adored those as well. Those are probably my two favorite series.
I have really good news for you. There is a new author named Galertner, published by Norton, who has written 2 books that are so like Patrick O'Brien, it just makes your heart stop. I will send you one.
Those
They are.
I'd love to read those.
You really will. The first one's called Held Fast, and the second one is called Captain Gray's Gambit. And they are Napoleonic, they're naval, they're just amazing. We've done really well with them, haven't we, Patrick?
yeah, we have. Yeah. I think O'Brien
Anyway,
I was going to say, I think O'Brien is due for a new resurgence, of interest. I think the movies brought him back for a while.
Yeah.
But there is a question that's just come in for you. Janice would like to know, who checks your Chinese content or your female content, etc.? Do you have any people that vet your stories?
I have, my wife is my first reader, and she's a very good reader. I have a friend in Lions Bay, Vancouver, Robin Spano, who is an author herself. And Robin is sort of my second reader. And then I have a former editor of the Toronto Star who reads my drafts for me. And I have 3 Chinese readers, 2 women, 1 guy, and they're the ones who do a lot of correcting. Okay, and one of the women lives in New York, the other in Toronto, and they have been just enormously useful. But what's interesting is I used to give them credits at the back of the book. I used to thank them for their help. And in my last book, the 2 Chinese women asked me not to list their names because they were considering going back to China for holiday, and they were nervous about what might happen if they were associated with my books. So, which I thought was interesting. Gives you an insight into the state of people's attitude about China.
Well, but if their names are in the earlier books, it probably doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I know, Barbara. But they asked me not to mention them, so I didn't. But they still do the reading for me, which is what matters most, I guess.
And they can probably bring up some of the real nuanced, subtle things that you might miss, right?
Well, they do, believe me. Like when you're writing about a banquet at a Chinese wedding, it gets really complicated and structured, and you have to get everything right. They are enormously helpful. They help me with names, in terms of maybe you shouldn't be using that Cantonese version, you should be using a Mandarin version, this or that, and so on and so on. Yeah. So
how did you first become interested in Asian culture?
By working there, by working in Asia.
I see.
And so I said I was always a crazy reader. I mean, I was always in a book. I was always reading a book. So when I started to do business in Asia, and I did business for 20 years there, I started to read everything I could get my hands on about the countries I was doing business in. Okay. So I was reading history, culture, whatever. And then of course you're meeting people there. And I was never afraid to ask questions. And I was always curious. So I was always asking about stuff. And how does this work? How does that work? You're calling him uncle, but is he a blood relation? You know? No, he's not a blood relation. This is how it works. So you get into that kind of conversation. And then I was invited to Chinese wedding. I went to Chinese funeral. So I saw all of this stuff and I absorbed it all, you know. But it fascinated me because there's a structure to it which is sort of timeless, you know. And so in fact, the book I'm writing now, I'm just writing about the reaction of people in China to their government, okay? And do they actually care what the government does? And the answer is probably they don't give a damn, okay? As long as they're left alone and their family is secure, they don't care. Because everything revolves around the family. That's the thing that moves forward. Governments come and go, systems come and go, but the family is there forever. And that's sort of the attitude that they have. And I try to reflect that in the books.
I've always thought the Chinese were, you know, historically and basically capitalists. You know, I mean, they've had a long history of central government, autonomous government, I mean, authoritarian government.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think about the Vietnamese whose flirtation with communism was fairly short-lived, and, you know, they're incredibly capitalist.
Yeah.
And I think if the Chinese Communist Party did not have such a grip, that they, you know, they would be what they were for forever, really busy merchants and, you know, family and as I say, basically capitalist.
Well, if you look back 5 years ago, that's the road they were headed down.
I know.
Okay, but then Xi, the new premier, has decided he wants to become chairman again.
Well, he wants to be Mao, just like Putin wants to be, you know, Stalin, and you get one of these guys like, yeah, you get Erdogan in Turkey, or, you know, Orhan in Hungary, or, you know, Trump in Washington, and you've got the same, you know, effort going on. It's like a surge, but it'll be interesting to see whether they survive or not.
Well, I mean, what Xi did was basically say to Jack Ma and all the capitalists who are all making billions, guys, the game's over, right? You're no longer going to be doing this. Okay, we're putting you out of business, basically, and so we'll see how long that lasts. But I suspect if and when Xi goes, things will revert.
Well, nobody lives forever, and even if he's got an iron grip at the moment, you know, he's not going to live forever. And I think they all think they will. I'm convinced that there's some, you know, this is sort of like the road to immortality or something that gets in their heads.
They've all got their billions of dollars stashed away, you know. So.
Yeah, I know, but it's like Uncle, you know, at some point, if you become ill, it doesn't really matter what all of that is.
It's the great leveling mechanism.
It's fascinating to watch.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else, Patrick, or should we thank Ian for sharing another hour with us?
Well, I think, let me just check the YouTube here. It looks like we should thank Ian for another wonderful hour.
Well, I will do that. I will also tell you that not this September, but next September, Rob and I are taking a cruise across the Great Lakes from Duluth, and we are ending up in Toronto. And I've decided that we're going to do like a whole Poison Pen day in Toronto. I'm going to put it together and get a bunch of you Canadian authors, and we're going to do like a day-long program in Toronto.
Well, you do have to make sure that I'm invited.
Of course. That's why I'm mentioning it to you. I've talked to Linwood about it, and Robert Povey, who also lives there. And I think we could really have, you know, our own sort of mini crime con in Toronto. Karen, I hope you're listening, because
that would be great.
Some organizing power here.
Topped off by a nice dinner. Topped off with a nice dinner and a nice bottle of wine.
Yeah, well, the advantage, you know, to the Zoom technology is that it now makes it possible for us to put a live group together, but also stream it so that people can watch it from
Yeah.
all over. And I wish that it were possible for more Canadian authors to penetrate the American market. There are some, some difficulties there. So I think it'd be great.
Thank you. Barbara, thank you
My
so much.
pleasure.
Patrick,
I really
thank you.
want to do that. Maybe Patrick can come along and be the tech person. Patrick, we'll have to see.
Take care,
how
guys.
you feel
Thank you.
about all that.
Thank you.
Anyway,
Support.
a real pleasure finale. But honestly, I would start with the first of the uncles, if you are not familiar with it, and read your way through the 4 F's. And the first one is called, let me look it up again. Is it Fate? Is
Fate.
that the first one? No.
Yeah.
Fate.
It is Fate, right? Unfortunately, we have them all at the
Behind
Poison Pen.
Yeah. I don't know if you noticed the nice product placement there, Ian. Of all
I
your-
saw that, Patrick. Thank you.
Good
Well,
night.
we
Good night, guys.
keep them
Good
all
night.
in stock. So, it's always our pleasure to find